Just to say, just to start with, just to say a little bit about RSSB, who we are and why it's us that's doing this, producing this report. We're an expert body, and we are whole industry. So we are made up of different parts of the industry, and we're unique in a sort of multi-stakeholder industry. We are genuinely part of the whole industry, and that gives us a system perspective. It gives us a perspective where we look at the railway in its entirety and look at it from a system view. And our role is to support safety and operational performance. And a big part of that is actually in understanding safety data for the industry and actually using that, helping the industry to use that effectively. So what this report is, it's one output from the evidence base that we use to support safety management and to make good safety-related decisions. So the key numbers then, the first sort of top-level view of what the report's saying. The first thing to say is really that we have significant growth again this year in passenger numbers. And that's good because it represents success for the railway, but it also creates challenges. And against that backdrop, against that challenging backdrop of growth, we do have some positive things to report. In particular, it's the 8th year in succession where we have not seen any fatalities to passengers or members of the workforce in train accidents, which is something to be pleased about. However, we know the railway is not a risk-free environment. We have seen 3 passenger fatalities, 2 workforce fatalities, 175 workforce major injuries and 326 public fatalities. So there are significant opportunities to learn in the data that we've seen. A little bit about the report. The reports are already upline if you want to download a copy and have a look at what I'm going through in more detail. The annual safety performance report gives detailed breakdown of our safety performance. Learning from operational experience talks much more about the key learning opportunities and the key industry initiatives that are underway. And it's much more of a qualitative report that includes much more general learning information. In terms of the scope of the ASPR, it is focused on the GB mainline railway, so essentially network rail managed infrastructure. There are some key changes this year in terms of scope. So we are including for the first time fully within scope risk from yards, depots and sidings, so off network rail maintained infrastructure. And also road driving risk, because that's been flagged as a really significant area for us to focus on, and I'll be saying a little bit more about that later. I think the other thing to say is that there's been work restructuring the annual safety performance report this year to bring its structure much more in alignment with the industry groups and the topic areas that the industry focuses on, because we really want this report to be a much more useful working document for the industry in terms of safety management. So just coming to what I said before, really, in terms of train accidents, we have seen eight successive years now where there has been no passenger or workforce fatality seen in train accidents, and actually only one was seen in the last 10 years, which was a single fatality at the derailment accident at Greyrig in Cumbria. And again, if we look at this historic chart, this shows the count of railway accidents, so it shows the number of railway accidents in each calendar year in which there was at least one fatality to workforce and members of the public. The line you'll see is a 10-year moving average, and you can see a quite significant reduction since where the graph starts. That's around about 1988. That is interesting to pick as a date to start with, because that was when the Clapham Junction rail accident happened. That was a real watershed in terms of safety management practice in the industry, and you can see since that time there have been some real successes in reducing the number of train accidents that we see. But this is quite a small data set, and it's not the only way that, as an industry, we analyse train accident risk. We also use the precursor indicator model. What that does is it uses, to create a more of a real-time metric around the risk, we use lower level occurrences and link those to the risk estimates from our safety risk model. So as an example, we have a derailment risk estimate in the safety risk model, and we link that to lower level data which occurs more regularly than the accidents themselves, for example, broken rails. And that gives us a much clearer picture of where the industry is with respect to train accident risk. It's also broken down in a range of different ways which allow more targeted analysis and more targeted measures and interventions. I mean, at a top level, what that shows is despite the recent performance we've seen, there is still a very recognised and tangible risk that remains for train accidents, and it still remains an area of huge focus for the industry. Probably at this point I should also mention some of the metrics that we'll be using in some of these graphs. There's an FWI, which is fatality and weighted injury. That equates different types of injuries to and major and minor injuries to fatality risk, And it does that so that we can come up with an aggregate measure and understand, build a more full picture of harm and risk for our analysis purposes. It equates, for example, 10 major injuries to 1 fatality. In terms of how we benchmark against other industries and other sectors, you can see here from this graph, this shows the yellow and green show passenger and workforce fatalities for the 10 largest railway networks in the European Union. You can see quite clearly there that GB safety performance is benchmarks very well against other major European railways. There is a limited data set here, so it doesn't. There are only certain things we're required to report into the European Railway Agency. So this is a subset of the data that's in the report, but it still provides a useful benchmark. And I guess the question that comes out is why? Why are we performing so well? And there's no one answer to that, because the safety performance of the industry is the sum total of all of the work that goes on across the whole network, day in, day out. But I think one area which links to the presentation today, where the European Railway Agency and some of our partners in Europe are particularly interested, is our safety data reporting. We do record much more information than other European countries, and we do, so that provides a focus for learning and monitoring, and actually we have a very open reporting culture and sharing of information as well. So that's something that is much envied, and there are active discussions underway across Europe about how other countries could learn from what we do in GB. This next chart is a comparison of modal risk, so it's looking at the risk of different transport modes compared against rail as a benchmark. Just leave a second for you to take that in, but obviously very significant safety performance on rail compared to other modes of transport. In terms of potentially higher risk train accidents then, so another metric that we use in the absence of much data around fatal train accidents is something called the potentially higher risk train accidents. This includes things like buffer stop collisions, it includes low speed train collisions, and it also includes derailment risk. And we can see from this graph the breakdown of different sorts of potentially higher risk train accidents. One thing to note in the recent years is a fairly significant amount of risk associated with derailments. But actually, in terms of passenger derailments, it's the second year in succession where we haven't seen any passenger train derailments, which is something to celebrate. Having said that, there have been incidents internationally which we've learned from and which are covered in the Learning from Operational Experience report, like the derailment due to a broken fish plate at Bretigny-sur-Orge in France in 2013. So we're still looking to learn, but the passenger derailment performance has been good, and that really throws into contrast the freight train derailment performance, where we've seen 14 freight train derailments over the past year. And this does follow a trend really of recent years, where Rail Accident Investigation Branch has investigated a number of freight train derailments. And there have been some common themes that have emerged around things like wagon loading, bogie design, track quality and maintenance. So there's a number of different issues which are coming to the fore, and a cross-industry working group has been set up to look at those and to look across the whole industry at the control framework that's in place to manage and prevent freight train derailments and to reduce the risk. Fortunately, we haven't seen much in the way of injuries or fatalities associated with freight train derailments for some time. But actually, you only have to look internationally at for example, at the freight train runaway derailment and explosion that happened at Lac Megantic in 2013 to see that there is significant risk associated with freight trains. Moving to SPADs now, signals passed at danger. We've seen an increase in the number of signals passed at danger this year, from 287 to 299, but we've seen a small decrease in the risk, and this is because each signal passed at danger that happens is subject to a fairly extensive risk assessment. And when we look at the risk that we see, it's generally driven by a small number of high-risk incidents. As an example, we could think about the recent SPAD of a steam train at Wootton Bassett, where the train went past a signal and ended up on a conflict point where a train had only recently just passed through. So very significant risk associated with that incident, and it's those sorts of incidents which drive the SPAD risk measure. We have seen a bit of a breakthrough in terms of analysis, which will help us understand SPAD risk much better and develop a much better metrics and more localised understanding of SPADs and their causes through work we've been doing with the University of Huddersfield. What's that's allowed us to do is get much better data on not just the numbers of times signals passed at danger, but the numbers of times that signals actually approach, that trains actually approach red signals. So it's a hugely valuable piece of information and something which is going to provide a real boost to the work we're doing, the industry is doing on a 10-year SPAD strategy, which is just kicking off now. So that's a very timely breakthrough in terms of the analytical possibilities that we've got. Moving to station risk now, we've seen 3 passenger fatalities in stations this year. 2 were at the platform train interface, and 1 was a slip, trips and falls on stairs. This graph shows the numbers of a breakdown of fatalities in each year and the different types of fatalities that have occurred. One thing that will leap out to you from a top-level view of the chart is the green and blue. So there are significant amounts of the most recent fatalities have generally been in the area of the platform train interface or slips, trips and falls. And actually the industry's launched a platform train interface strategy recently that is now progressing to look at a full programme of work with short, medium and long-term actions to address different aspects of the PTI risk. This is a slightly different chart. This shows harm by accident type to passengers. Again, slips, trips and falls and passenger train interface accidents or harm features quite heavily in this. In this case, you see because a disproportionate amount of the risk from PTI is fatality risk, when you look at this chart, it actually throws the slips, trips and fall risk into a bit of sharper contrast. And that is an area where the industry is doing some active work. The People on Trains and Stations Risk Group, which is an industry group run by RSSB, has kicked off some initial analysis around slips, trips and falls, and that's now progressing into a phase of sharing that work with industry to support management of slips, trips and falls. And another thing to draw people's attention to, which is more in the detail of the report, is the assault, passenger and public assault risk. So we've seen, if you see the line there, that's the normalised rate. So that's taking into account the growth that we're seeing. And you can see that even on a normalised basis, the numbers of passenger and public assaults that we're seeing on the network are increasing. So there's something that needs further investigation and further review there. And that has been flagged as the next priority area for the People on Trains and Stations risk group once the slips, trips and falls work has been progressed. In terms of workforce, there were 3 workforce fatalities this year. 2 were road driving accidents. 1, the driver of a tractor who was involved with work on the Borders project, and the other was a motorcycle fatality associated with a member of Network Rail staff commuting between work sites. The 3rd fatality was a train cleaner who was electrocuted in a depot. I mean, some of the things that at the top level figure, this really does highlight the significance of road driving risk in the risk profile of the rail industry workforce. That's something that's been flagged and again through industry working groups. A cross-industry group, the Road Driving Risk Group, has been set up, and that's looking at a range of different initiatives to deal with road driving risk. One of the first things to do is actually to uncover the scale of the problem, which comes down to data reporting and analysis. There is a huge opportunity here in that we're currently going through a programme of work to upgrade the National Safety Incident Reporting System, SMIS, and incorporate within it not just incident data, but also close call data. So incidents where accidents could have happened but didn't. So a much richer data set. And as part of that work, we will be specifying exactly what data we think we need to fully understand the road driving risk work and to drive strategies and improvement work in that area. In terms of trends, general trends in harm to the workforce, workforce harm has reduced a little in the last calendar year on an absolute basis, but actually when it's normalised, it's fairly level because we've seen a slight reduction in the numbers of workforce hours this year. There were 10 fatalities at level crossings this year. And if we look at how that breaks down, there were 8 fatalities to pedestrians, 2 fatalities to road vehicle occupants. We have seen an increase in the fatalities and weighted injuries, the harm figure, but we have seen a reduction in the number of collisions. So again, the data is quite sparse in this area. At the top level, it doesn't really give you a clear understanding of what's happening with the overall level of risk. One thing to note from this graph, as with the previous one on the potentially high-risk train accidents, is it is apparently evident of some sort of step change over the last 5 years. And that's something for us to keep an eye on as we progress. In terms of public fatalities, so this is fatalities relating to both trespass and suicide, with 315 public fatalities this year. 22 of them were trespass incidents, 293 were suicides. That is the highest that we've seen, and you can see that from the next graph in terms of how we've done against previous years. There is a lot of work going on in the industry to manage suicide risk through work with the Samaritans, British Transport Police, Network Rail, the unions and others. And there's a whole range of programmes of work going on. Again, data collection is a key part of that to understand the nature of the problem, not just where suicides happen, but where station staff and others have successfully intervened to prevent suicides from happening. And there has been a significant amount of training of frontline staff across the industry to support that. In terms of these initiatives, for obvious reasons, these aren't some things that we talk too much about, but there is a huge amount of work going on. So in summary, really, just to set the context, there are challenges for the railway, and there are challenges associated with growth, which are good challenges to have. And in the face of that growth, in the face of a growing railway, we have some positive things to report. The continued good performance around train accident risk is something to be thankful for and to keep an eye on. Again, we've seen no passenger train derailments in the last 2 years, but rail is not a risk-free environment. 39 people were fatally injured on the railways this year. There was a 6% increase in passenger assaults, and also at the top level figures, 315 public fatalities. So again, in the detail of the report, there's a lot more to focus on and for the industry to understand, which is why we've done this work, to bring the information much more fully within the working practices of the various industry groups. So the report should be on the website now, as I said previously. And just before I finish, just wanted to say one thing, which is as RSSB, we're only able to do this work because of the collaborative efforts that goes on in all quarters of the railway industry and beyond, with various partners, both in different sectors and also internationally. And really, this work's only really possible because of the emphasis that the whole industry places on safety and the priority that it gives it. And that's all I was going to say. Thank you.